Well, if you have your Bibles, open up to Ruth chapter 1 with me. That's our reading for this morning. Ruth chapter 1, we're going to pick up the story in verse 6 together. And so hear now the word of the Lord. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marriage? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more, also if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Well, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can have a seat this morning. Road trips. You either hate them or you love them. Personally, I'm not a fan. When they go according to plan, they can be a great time, but when things go wrong, they can oftentimes go very wrong. To the point that there's this moment in your mind that you think to yourself, maybe it's best that we turn back. Maybe it's best that we return home. This is just not going right. We need to just go back. I started here at RLC in February of 2015. And that following January, I took the youth on our first winter retreat together. We had booked a cabin up in Prescott that was just next to a Christian camp. It was going to be a great time of fellowship, of just kind of relaxation there in the cabin. Hopefully there would be some snow that we could play in and have some fun in. And so we left Phoenix on a Friday afternoon, and as we began to go north on the 17, we kind of got word that there was this great snowstorm up in Flagstaff, and they had closed the 17 just north of the turnoff for Prescott. And problem averted, right? We were in luck. And so we made the drive. We get to Prescott. We stopped for dinner. It had begun snowing. And as we ate, the snow had picked up a little bit. Nothing to worry about. And so we left dinner and we began to travel up to the cabin. As we made our way through town, it became clear that the snow was not letting up and that Prescott wasn't doing a lot to necessarily clear the roads in a timely manner. And so we made the turn off the main road after we came through the city, and we began to go up the mountain to the camp, to where this cabin was. And very quickly after making that turn, things changed drastically. The snow was falling a bit heavier. The snow had not been plowed, and so we were forging a path through the snow. And there was this brief moment as I was driving a 15-passenger van full of teenagers that I had to make the decision. Should I turn around, or had we come too far? Was it more dangerous to turn around and come back down the hill with all this fresh snow? And so we pushed forward. We kept going, the road becoming more and more covered. The last 15 minutes of that drive took 45 minutes to an hour. I didn't want to bring the van to a complete stop because I knew if I did, it would get stuck, and so I would have to make turns very slowly. Every time I depressed the pedal, the van would slide a bit under the snow. It's probably the most nervous I'd ever been while driving, and even up until this point, those other volunteers that were in the van with me, it bonded us. But we made it to the cabin. We parked, we unloaded, and we woke up to nothing but white around us. By the grace of God, we had made it. Everything was fine. We had to dig out the van the next day, put snow chains on the tires. But there was this moment in that journey. Should we turn back? And in that moment, your choice becomes very clear. No, I need to press forward. In our reading today, we see Naomi come to that decision with Orpah and Ruth. And last week, we left Naomi at a very dark moment in her life. She had just lost her husband. She had just lost her two sons. There she was in the enemy territory of Moab. And all she had left were her two daughters-in-law, two Moabite women that her sons had married, and presumably it was led to the deaths. And despite that dire situation that Ruth's in, do you remember the theme of the book? Do you remember the message of the book that we saw? That amid a broken and sinful world, God sovereignly moves to ensure that His will is achieved. That even at this dark time in Naomi's life, we know that God is at work at the background. That He is moving things along in this story. And this part of the story continues on that theme. And we see something amazing about God's work in our life. Something that most of us in this room can relate to. That in the midst of our grief, God has not abandoned us, but that He has given us a family. That in the midst of the darkness in our lives, in the midst of the depression, the sadness, the loss, the mourning, that our God has not abandoned us, that He's just not left us out in enemy territory, but that He has given us a family to walk with us. That it's in the midst of those trials and tribulations, where even though it might seem like we've been forgotten, that God has provided help and a comfort for us. See, in the story, Naomi is not able to see the final outcome. Naomi's in the trenches. She's in the midst of the storm. She cannot see outside of what's going on in front of her face, but we can. We've read the book. We know how it ends. And we know what's about to come. And so too in our lives, we must remember that in the midst of things, in the trenches and in the storm, that God has an outcome for us. Now, at this point in the story, there's an issue that's been raised to us, and it needs to be fixed. It needs to be dealt with and taken care of. See, Naomi is in Moab. Elimelech's family, what remains of his family. Remember, his name, Elimelech, means my God is king. They are stuck there in enemy territory, and they need to return to Bethlehem. And so at the very beginning of chapter 1, we see that issue come to a resolution in verses 6, 7, and verse 22, what we call the situation of the family. And so let's look together at those verses. It says, "Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab," literally the land of Moab, "for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given him food." See, ultimately, what's going to bring Naomi back to Bethlehem? She has not been in Moab for a short period of time. She's been there for a long period of her life. We know that she's been there for more than 10 years. Remember, it's after the marriage of her sons to the Moabite women that it says they remained there for 10 years. We don't know how long they'd been there previous to that. But Naomi has become ingrained there in Moab, in the community. She has extended family now. She has a home. There have been some fields probably left to her. And so what's the ultimate cause for her to leave? Well, she overhears in the fields as people are working the fields of Moab. They're talking, they're conversing. News has reached them that Yahweh, the great God of Israel, has visited his people, that he has returned from a trip. See, in their minds, God is just another territorial deity of the ancient Near East. And when the rain stopped coming upon Israel, God had left. He had abandoned them. Maybe he went on a trip. But now he has returned. He has visited. And he has brought them food. I mean, this is a reversal of what we see taking place in verse 1. And so Moab hears through the grapevine that God has returned, that God has relented of his judgment against the people. Rain has returned to the land. Food has returned to Bethlehem. Remember, Bethlehem means the house of bread, and so the house is now producing again. And so she hears of this change there in the field, perhaps as she's working. And she makes the decision, now's a good time to return to Bethlehem after 10 years. We might deem Naomi here a fair weather fan. Surely you know the saying. Fair weather fans are fans that are fans of a sports team at the good times. They don't stick around through all the hard times. I mean, this past year, Naomi would have been the one wearing a Diamondbacks hat and a shirt after they made it to the World Series, having not been a fan before. She probably didn't even care about the Diamondbacks. But she's a fair weather fan, and so now that she sees that God has smiled again upon Israel, she wants to go back. She wants to return to her homeland. And see, we can learn something here from Naomi. See, it's easy for us to follow God when things are good. It's easy for us to walk in faith when everything is going right in our lives. when we're prospering, when there's bountiful harvest in our fields. But our faith is tested, our faith is strengthened in the tough times. And so we should not shy away from the trials and the tribulations, but we should see God's glory in it, God's plan in it. James 1, verses 2 through 4. James, writing there to all the Christians that have been dispersed from Jerusalem by persecution, says this: "Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." James says, listen, in this persecution, count it all joy, brothers and sisters, because God is at work. Your faith is being strengthened. Your faith is producing steadfastness. And that, when it has its full effect, when it's become full grown, when it gives birth, it means that you are complete, perfect, lacking in nothing, that your faith has been strengthened. Paul, writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 4, 16 to 18, says this about persecution. He says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." Even though we're dying, even though we're being beaten, even though our things are falling apart, our outer self is wasting away because of sin, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And he explains what he means by that. He says, "For this light, momentary affliction." I mean, that's how Paul is describing persecution. That's how Paul is describing hardship. Light, momentary affliction. And that's Paul, who's been beaten with rods. He's been stoned. He's been shipwrecked. He's been imprisoned. And he says it's light, momentary affliction. And it's preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are transient, the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. See, when times are hard, when life is knocking you down, when all hope seems lost, it's in those times that you must turn to God. It's in those times that you must not lose heart, that you see the glory lying behind your affliction, that you see God working through the trials and the tribulations. Elimelech and his family fled Israel when the famine hit. They abandoned the land of Yahweh and they went into enemy territory. And now Naomi returns when she hears everything has returned to normal in Israel. And so in verse 7, so she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. They begin a close to 50-mile trek from Moab to Jerusalem, and it's a rather perilous journey that spans mountains and valleys. Verse 22, we get a little more context to this. Again, it creates almost this inclusio in the text. There's these bookends. They return there from the country of Moab, and notice when they come back, they come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest, the barley harvest. This harvest would take place in late April, early May. Shortly after the barley harvest, the wheat harvest would follow, showing the abundance that Yahweh has now given to the land. And it was this first fruit of the barley harvest that would be brought to the Lord in keeping with the law. In Leviticus 23:10, it says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest." See, God has relented of his judgment against the nation at this time so that they might be faithful to the law. There seems to be some sort of testing on Yahweh's part. Remember the cycle of the judges. This takes place during that book. That Israel would do what was right in her own eyes, that the people would fall into sin, that God would send his judgment to them, a foreign nation, to oppress them, to enslave them, that the people would then cry out for deliverance, they would repent of their sinfulness, and that God would deliver them. So the people have repented, and yet God gives them this test of faith. Are you going to offer up the first fruits to me in keeping with the law? And so this is the situation of the family. They've left on this journey. They're leaving Moab. They're returning to Bethlehem at this good time to return. There's food, plentiful food there. And so that's the situation we're in. And now we come to the focus of this chapter, what I've called the pleas of Naomi. So look back at verse 8. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." At some point in this journey to Bethlehem, Naomi comes to that moment in the road trip. Did I make the right choice? Are we doing the right thing? Do we need to alter something here? And Naomi comes to this realization that her daughters-in-law need to return to their home. They need to go back to Moab. And what we see in this dialogue that takes place between the daughters and Naomi is that this is a tough decision for not only Naomi to make, but for the daughters-in-law to make. I mean, this isn't a relatively new relationship. They've known each other for 10 years. These two women were married to her sons. They were a part of Naomi's family. They had shared meals together and time together. They had worked in the fields together. And Naomi comes to this realization of what life is going to be like for them in Israel. And she realizes the issues that could come up. First and foremost, that these are 2 extra mouths now for them to feed. I mean, keep in mind, as Naomi returns to Bethlehem, she's returning essentially homeless. All she has is what she can carry with her from Moab. And we have no indication in the text that she brings any sort of donkey, animal, camel, horse, whatever with her. She's just carrying what she has. She's returning homeless. She's going to need to rely on extended family there in Bethlehem to help provide for her. And now she's bringing 2 extra mouths to feed. On top of that, she's returning with 2 Moabites, 2 enemies of Israel. And they're going to be despised in Bethlehem, likely to be shunned by the city because of their heritage. And so it's at this point in the journey, and we don't know where they're at. This could be 5 miles in, this could be 25 miles in, this could be 40 miles in. And Naomi gives them 2 simple instructions. And they're repeated throughout this dialogue. She says, "Go and return." And she says to them, "Return to your mother's house." And that phrase there should give us pause. Why would Naomi tell her daughters-in-law to return to their mother's house in this patriarchal world? We wouldn't think anything of it if it said, "Go and return to your father's house." That would make sense to us, but there's something interesting in this command. The phrase, if you were to Google it, if you were to look for it in the rest of our scriptures, appears in the Song of Songs in 2 places there. And it's used not in reference to a house, but primarily in reference to a room. A room where marital arrangements would have been made. And when we look at verse 9, we see what Naomi is saying to them. Look at verse 9. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Naomi is telling her daughters-in-law, return to your mother's room, return to your mother's house, so that you might have a chance at remarriage. So that you might not be widows for the rest of your life. Because if you come with me to Bethlehem, that is surely your future. There will be no hope of remarriage for you. Because you are Moabites. You are daughters of the enemy. And so return to your mother's house that you would be remarried. Naomi wants nothing but the best for her daughters-in-law. She even asks that God would deal kindly with them. And that word there, kindly, is the Hebrew word of a chesed, right? The chesed love of God. It's used in reference to God's love, to his covenant faithfulness, to his grace, his mercy, his kindness, and his loyalty. It's so rife with substance that we don't even have one word in our English language to describe it. We have to choose from 7. And Naomi here, despite the darkness in her life, despite her depression, her sadness, her loss, she still understands God's power and his sovereignty. She says, may the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you might find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. She sees God's power. She sees God's sovereignty extending outside of the land of Israel and into the territory of Chemosh, that false god of Moab. That even there, God can bring blessing to these women. But in verse 10, we see the love that they have for their mother-in-law. They lift up their voices and they wept. And they said to her, no. We will return with you to your people. They have dealt kindly with Naomi. They have loved her. They've provided for her. They have given her some semblance of normalcy in a land that is not her own. And they're connected with her. They don't want to leave her. And so if Naomi is destined to go to Bethlehem, the house of bread, then that's where they're going to go as well. But Naomi pleads with them. In verse 11, the future is bleak. Turn back. Return. My daughters, why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. And even if I should say that I have hope that I will find another one, what are you going to do? You're going to wait around until I give birth to a couple of sons? Or you're going to wait around till they're grown, that they're ready for marriage? Are you going to then marry them? No, that's insane. There is no hope here for you. Go, return. I mean, hear the pain in her voice. This is not an easy decision for her. This is the only family she has left, yet she sees that it is in their best interest to leave her and return to Moab where they might have a chance. And so she pleads with them. She's pushing them away. She's giving them every reason to leave. In the 1980s, there was a movie that came out called Harry and the Hendersons. Maybe you've seen the movie, maybe you haven't, but it kind of popped into my head as I was studying. See, the Hendersons are this family. They befriend a Bigfoot named Harry. They accidentally hit him and kill him as they're driving in the woods. They think he's dead. He's not. But there's this point in the movie where they need Harry to leave because there are people tracking Harry down so that they can study him and make a science project out of him. And so they take him into the woods, and Harry doesn't want to separate from the family, and the dad, George, is just begging him, you need to leave. And then there's this moment in the movie where George realizes that the only way that he can get Harry to go is he needs to turn on Harry. And so he yells at him, get out of here, leave. I don't want you around anymore. We don't need you. We don't want you here. Go back home. And yet he's yelling these things kind of through tears. And as I was reading this, that's what I saw in Naomi, that through tears, she is begging with these women, go and return to your house. You have no future. There is no hope. I can't offer you anything. Go and return. And in verse 13, we see the pain. She says, no, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Remember, she knows, she's aware of God's sovereignty and everything that's happened, and she here places the blame squarely at God's feet. She sees God as being the one who brought her plight. God is the one behind the tragedy of her life. She says that he has dealt bitterly with her, and that word's going to pop up again at the end of the chapter. But can you relate to Naomi here? Certainly during dark times, you've cried out to God. And it's all right to question God. Many in the scriptures have approached God with questions about their place in his will or why things have happened in their life. It's not wrong to ask questions, but we must be careful never to question God's character. Notice Naomi sees that, yes, the Lord has dealt bitterly with me, that the hand has gone out before me against me, but she never once questions the very character of God. That's where we must be careful. Our question should come from a place of trust and humility, knowing that God has a plan. And so Naomi has questions for God. She is struggling. And at this point, she cannot see the purpose behind her pain. And so in this final plea, we see that Orpah's mind is changed in verse 14. They lifted up their voices and they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. And I was reading one theologian that said, and at this point, Orpah walks out of the pages of Scripture. We don't know what becomes of her. But Ruth clung to her. She's not leaving. Now, see, the logical choice went out in Orpah's mind. Logically, she has a better chance of survival in Moab than in Bethlehem, at least from a human perspective. But Ruth clings to her mother-in-law. Ruth has a greater understanding of God than Orpah does. So we've seen the plea of Naomi, and now we come to the commitment of Ruth. Look at verse 15. Naomi makes one final push. She said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. There's an indication here in the text that if Ruth returns to Moab, that she's going to return to the false worship of Chemosh and the other local deities. And at this point, we don't know where Ruth stands in her commitment to God. But if she returns to her family in Moab, it is probable that she's going to end up back in the false worship of Moab. And so there's a lot more at stake here behind the scenes than just a husband. There is proper biblical worship of the one true God. And so Naomi's pushing her away, but look at the response of Ruth in verse 16. It's a beautiful speech of Ruth's commitment to not only Naomi, but to her people. And this speech is a reversal of the commands that Naomi gave to Ruth of go and return to your home. And so she says Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. From where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord, may Yahweh, do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Notice that Ruth pledges her life to Naomi. These two women were once introduced to one another through marriage, but nothing is going to separate them. Orpah made the choice. Her people were going to be her people. Chemosh was going to be her God. But Ruth's roots and religions are no longer in the land of Moab. She is committed not only to Naomi, but she is committed now to Israel. She has abandoned Chemosh, and she has pledged her loyalty to Yahweh. This passage often gets read at weddings, and I can see why. Because during a wedding, a man and a woman make a commitment to one another that goes far beyond anything the world could think of. It goes far beyond any commitment that humanity could ever come up with. In Genesis 2:24-25, we read this, a command of Yahweh. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. They become one. They are connected to one each other. Their people become each other's people. Their family become each other's family. Where they go, they both go. Where they lodge, they both lodge. But Ruth does something here that seems very far out of left field. Notice in verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. In the ancient Near Eastern world, they operated under a worldview that the false gods were fallen angels that had been given authority over the various kingdoms of the world. And you can read that if you want in Deuteronomy 32. It's not that vital to this right now. But what we see here is that Ruth is making this commitment of where you die, I'm going to die, there I'll be buried, meaning I am going to be buried in enemy territory because Yahweh is now my God. Ian Duguid says this, she is even willing to die and be buried in Naomi's land, the land of Naomi's God, not the gods of the Moabites. Given the intimate connection between land and deity in the ancient Near East and the importance of proper burial for a restful afterlife, this was the ultimate commitment in the ancient world. She further binds herself to do this with an oath of self-imprecation. If she reneges on her promise, she invites the Lord, Naomi's God, to stretch out his hand to strike her down. There is an astonishing act of surrender and self-sacrifice. Ruth was laying down her entire life to serve Naomi. Ruth understands what this commitment means. Ruth knows what's going to happen in Israel. And yet she is committed to Naomi. She is committed to Yahweh. She is not going to leave. So we see the plea of Naomi, we see the commitment of Ruth, and finally we now come to the homecoming. Verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. It's stirred up. The idea in the word is that there's a sense of joy in the homecoming of Naomi. That the city here is echoing with excitement. Naomi has returned, but wait, she has returned with no husband and no sons. And now here she has this Moabite woman with her, and so this question is then asked by the women in the city, well, is this Naomi? Is this the one that left with Elimelech? That had 2 sons, and now here she returns, no sons, no husband, and there's this Moabite woman with her? What is going on? And very quickly, Naomi kind of corrects them. Look at what she says. She says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. She says, call me Mara. It's the noun form of the verb that's translated as bitterly. Why does she want to be called Mara? For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full. I had family. I had a husband and sons, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Again, we see her understanding of God's hand in all of this. So why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? And that's what she wants to be called now. And I find it interesting in the text that there is no other place in Ruth where she's called Mara. Despite her request, she is called Naomi throughout the rest of the book. Because only the Lord changes your name. You only go from Abram to Abraham because of God. You only go from Sarai to Sarah because of God. Naomi doesn't get to determine her name. Her name's been given to her. She is Naomi. There's some continued irony in this story. Maybe you picked up upon it. Remember last week I mentioned that Naomi is often viewed as the female Job in a lot of ways. She's lost everything as Job had lost everything. But do you see the irony here in what she's just said? She claims to have returned to Bethlehem empty. But is that true? Does she really return empty? Or has she returned with Ruth? Ruth, who gave up everything to come with her. Ruth, who has committed herself to be by Naomi's side for the rest of her life. Ruth, who has even said, if I am not faithful to you, may the Lord strike me down. Yet Naomi does not notice it. She is still dealing with the loss of her family, but she fails to see the blessing of God in her life. It is those moments when everything is falling apart that we need to lean into our understanding of who God is and how God works in the lives of his followers. See, friends, in the midst of your grief, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your sorrow and your sadness, God has not abandoned you, but he has given you a family. And not just an immediate family or an extended family, but he has given you a church family. Naomi wasn't completely empty. She had Ruth, and more importantly, she had God. And so too, you are never completely empty in your grief. You are never completely alone in your sadness and in the pain of your life. You have a family. You have God. You have a church that is here to walk with you through tough times. You are not alone. You are not empty. God has given you a great blessing in a family in the church. And so, friends, see God's sovereignty in your life. Through the trials, through the tribulations. But see God's sovereignty in the blessings of the church and in the blessings of your family. Let's pray. Father, I just come before you today, Lord, so thankful for this story. Lord, a story of loss, a story of sorrow, a story that many can relate to. And Lord, help us to see that even in the midst of Naomi's struggles, even in the midst of Naomi's darkness, that you were there. And Lord, help us to see that in the midst of our trials, our tribulations, that you are there. that you have not abandoned us, that you have not forsaken us, that you have not dealt bitterly with us, but that you have given us a blessing in our families and in our church, that we are able to walk together through darkness, and that in it all our faith is strengthened. And so God, for that we give you thanks and praise. And so Lord, continue to bless us as we continue to seek to glorify you in all that we do. And we pray this in your holy and precious name. Amen.